Mr. Heiser.
and a hearing officer.
Do we have Mr. Smitherman?
I believe we do. Miguel.
I'm here.
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So, Mr. Smitherman, could you please state your name for the record?
John R. Smitherman.
And your testimony in this matter has previously been admitted, is that correct?
That's correct.
Exhibit A1 and rebuttal exhibit, misplaced it, 40, is it 43? 41. 41, is that correct?
It's late in the day. I'll have to trust you.
All right, thank you for that. Do you have any corrections to your direct testimony?
Not that I recall.
Oh, just wanted to recollect for you. Did you find a small, a mathematical error in one of the tables in your testimony?
Oh, thank you for reminding me. Yes, I did. It's basically I referred to the wrong cell in a spreadsheet. We corrected that, and that was in between the filings that Moga made and today.
And so you've corrected that in some testimony and some of the materials you're going to present today. Is that correct?
I will talk about that today. It makes a small change in actually some numbers on two different slides because it cascades.
Okay, so we'll point that out when we get to it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Did you prepare a summary of your direct testimony?
I did.
Would you like to present that summary?
Be happy to do so. I'll start with direct. If you don't mind. Let's see. Is that sharing properly?
Yes.
Fabulous. It's not advancing properly. There we go. Thank you. Board Chair, Vice Chair, board members, Madam Hearing Officer. To start with, in section 20.2.50.116 LDAR, Moga had offered and NMED has now accepted our suggestion to allow up to 30 days for the repair of a leak that's discovered through LDAR, with some exceptions. We appreciate that change. As you probably have heard from other witnesses, sometimes things take longer than we expect them to take. Sometimes they take longer than we'd like them to take. And to be able to reliably repair all leaks that we find, for the most part, within 15 days was just probably unmanageable. Now, currently we have a lot of supply chain issues due to the pandemic, but even in the future, we're still going to have issues trying to get parts when they're not on hand. We also have the opportunity to to tag certain parts that you can't repair in that time with a tag labeled repair delayed. So you'll know which ones have been found but have not been able to be addressed in that time frame. So we appreciate NME accepting that change. Also, operators are already obligated to perform leak detection and repair on equipment, either because they've got a permit that requires it, or they're subject to NSPS Quad A series. So we want to make sure that these two programs align and are not duplicative of each other. So we have suggested language that would make sure that we do avoid that. And so far, I've heard that NMED has accepted that concept.
And so by that, you mean that you heard Ms. Keene's testimony earlier today that if we perform a Quad O or Quad OA inspection and it meets the requirements of the Part 50 program, it can be used for both.
That's correct. That's exactly what I heard. So I assume that they're not going to be duplicative. Trying to use my keyboard to advance things, and it's not being very cooperative. Also, Moga has suggested that not only equipment that's used in air and steam service, but also equipment that deals with fluids that have less than 10% VOC by weight, including coal bed methane, be removed from the LDAR requirements also. At a minimum, we need to exclude all non-hydrocarbon gases, nitrogen, CO2, H2S, and things like that. As a reminder to everyone, this part is intended to reduce ozone precursors, NOx and VOCs. And so it is appropriate that we apply these LDAR requirements to sources that have fluids in them that have significant percentages of NOx or VOCs, particularly VOCs. Also, we believe that NMD should align the AVO inspection frequencies with the OCD's inspection requirements as applicable. We really understand that AVOs are an important part of a full complement of inspection protocols, but it does not make sense to have two different rules from different agencies that don't align. It creates confusion that's avoidable.
So for this, it would be, you would be seeking something, for example, like a confirmation from NMED that AVOs conducted to meet the OCD requirement may also be used to satisfy the NMED requirement.
That's correct. Optimally, we would define the requirements for AVOs under this rule to align with the requirements under the OCD rule. But at a minimum, they would recognize each other. The NMED's latest red line, at their September 16th red line, they've suggested that LDAR frequencies result in extraordinarily high emissions reduction costs, and costs are important. Imposing requirements that are not cost effective, as you've heard many witnesses say, will result in overly burdensome compliance costs that will lead to negative impacts to state and local communities, because it'll end up causing wells to be plugged prematurely. I've also testified that there are flaws in ERGs, that's Eastern Research Group's anticipated cost and emission reduction calculations. We will talk about that in more detail later, but I do want to incorporate those statements here, and I'll use my rebuttal for a deeper dive into those issues. That concludes my summary of the direct and rebuttal.
I think, Madam Hearing Officer, for the purposes of expedition, we were going to move to Mr. Smitherman's rebuttal as well to get that done.
Yes.
And then what I think would be most expeditious is the parties have reached agreement, I think, on most issues. There's, I think, like 7 slides where there might be a proffer, and maybe it'd be easiest just for when Mr. Smitherman reaches that, for me to state what the proffer would be, and then we move on to the next slide after that, if that meets your approval.
I think that sounds like an efficient way to do it. Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Smitherman, you can please bring up your rebuttal slides.
Working on that now, sir.
And then, Madam Hearing Officer, could you check with the reporter and make sure she's hearing Mr. Smitherman okay? He seems a little bit fainter than he has been in the past.
Cheryl, how are we doing?
Yes, he is a little soft-spoken. I would have liked him to speak up if he can.
I'll do my best. Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I open my slides, first and foremost, Moga supports a requirement on LDAR at least annually on every well site, every gathering and boosting station, every gas processing plant, and every transmission compressor station in New Mexico. This is not a debate about whether LDAR should be required. It's a discussion about the frequency of the LDAR surveys, how many times per year they should be required. No one should miss the fact that Moga is supportive of expanding LDAR to the up to 92% of wells in New Mexico that are not currently required to perform LDAR surveys under the NSPS Quad O series. That is adding up to 43,982 wells to LDAR. Please do not lose sight of that as we discuss frequencies and thresholds. LDAR is expensive and costs matter. More frequent surveys lead to more compliance costs. More frequent surveys also lead to reduction in emissions. However, I'm going to show you that the added VOC emissions reductions from NMED's proposed increased LDAR frequency do not warrant the extraordinary added costs on a dollar per ton basis. To get to that result, I will first walk you through how LDAR costs and emissions reductions are calculated. While doing so, I will make the case that the data that Moga used in its calculations are the best data available for that purpose, contemporary New Mexico specific data. I will contrast our data with that used by the department through their contractor ERG, old non-New Mexico specific data. The concept of how emissions reductions from LDAR are calculated is really pretty straightforward. I will use a well site as an example. In the first step, a theoretical average well site is devised. Another name for that is a model plant. This average well site model plant has an average number of all the typical equipment that you might find at a well site: separators, heater treaters, compressors, etc. Now, there are several sources, data sources available for determining what a model plant should look like. Moga has selected a model plant data that is the most representative of operations in New Mexico today. Once the amount of equipment for the model plant is determined, the second step is to apply an average number of components that could be sources for leaks associated with each equipment type: connectors, valves, etc. This gives you a total number of all components on the model plant. Third, an average leak rate is applied to each of the components. Now, this average leak rate doesn't mean that every such component leaks that amount. It is a statistical average. For example, if in a study you determine that 1 in 100 valves is found to have a leak, and the leak rate for that one valve is 50 cubic feet per hour, then the average leak rate for all valves would be 0.5 cubic feet per hour, 50 divided by 100. The data used to determine these statistical averages generally includes large emitters in their data set. As such, these emission factors are designed to be representative of all leaks, including large emitters. Finally, the statistical leak rates per component are summed to get a total statistical leak rate for the well site model plant. But that's whole gas. VOCs make up just part of the gas that might leak, so a factor is used to adjust the total leak rate to yield a VOC leak rate for the well site model plant. Moga created 3 model plants for well sites and a separate one for gathering and boosting stations. To create its model plants, Moga used the most recent greenhouse gas reporting program data from the San Juan Basin and the Permian Basin for its well site model plants, and a recent Colorado State University / Department of Energy study for its gathering and boosting model plant. ERG used older and less New Mexico specific EPA Control Techniques Guideline, or CTG, for their model plants. To arrive at the effectiveness of LDAR to reduce leak rates for any model plant, EPA has established a table of reduction factors for specific LDAR survey frequencies. They actually have two tables, one for each of the main two LDAR techniques, but they're very close. As you will see, increasing the frequency of LDAR has diminishing returns. While the leak rate reduction effectiveness goes up with higher frequencies, there are diminishing returns for increasing the frequency. To put these leak volumes and leak volume reductions on a cost per ton basis, the results that I just described must be coupled with the associated cost of LDAR surveys. This yields the cost per ton for such surveys. That is the calculation that is important if you're comparing the choices of applying LDAR or not applying LDAR. That's not what's being considered here. The more germane calculation is the incremental cost of more frequent LDAR and the incremental reduction in VOC emissions associated with that same change in frequency. Excuse me. That is what I will do for you today. And as you will see, the results are extremely high incremental cost for those small reductions in VOC volumes. This extraordinary investment is not prudent, given the testimony we've already heard from Mr. McNally, that VOC reductions have only a modest impact on ozone concentration in this region. This rule targets ozone formation. The most impactful ozone precursor is NOx, not VOCs in most regions. I hope that by the end of my testimony, you will be comfortable with how these calculations are made. You will agree that the data Moga used are appropriate, and you will see that the LDAR frequencies NMED is asking for are unreasonably expensive relative to those recommended by Moga. I urge you to accept Moga's suggested changes will result in LDAR being performed 1 to 4 times, excuse me, 1 to 4 times per year at every well site, and 2 to 4 times a year at every gathering and boosting station, every gas processing plant, and every transmission compression station. So let's dive into the numbers, shall we?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Smitherman. If you would, please find a good stopping point in the next couple of minutes. I need to take a little bit of public comment before we proceed with the rest of your testimony.
You know, Ms. Worth, your timing is perfect. This is a great stopping point.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for stopping sharing. It is 5 minutes. I see our first public commenter on the platform. This is our 5 o'clock public comment session. I did have these folks reach out to the board administrator. Brenda McKenna, Dee DiCamillo, David Anderson, and April Perkins. If you are on the platform and I did not just call your name, please reach out through the chat. Comment is taken on audio, not video, is taken under a brief oath, and is limited to 5 minutes. Ms. McKenna, I'm unmuting you. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly. Thank you. If you would please spell your name for the transcripts.
Very good. It is Brenda McKenna. Brenda is B-R-E-N-D-A. McKenna is M-C-K-E-N-N-A.
Thank you. If you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Brenda McKenna, and I represent District 9 in the New Mexico State Senate, which includes the counties of Bernalillo and Sandoval counties. I express my appreciation to the Environmental Improvement Board for organizing this public forum. Why is New Mexico earning an F on smog? We are earning an F by failing our fellow New Mexicans who call the counties of Lee, Eddy, and San Juan counties home. This is because they live where volatile organic compounds that drive the creation of smog are polluting the air moms, dads, grandparents, aunts, uncles, children, and infants breathe every day. What does smog do? It damages lungs, exacerbates asthma and emphysema, and causes heart disease and cancer. How many of us would choose to live in that kind of environment that would shorten and degrade your life, or even more especially that of your kids and grandkids? Governor Lujan Grisham and Secretary Kenny are moving forward to turn the F grade around, and I support them wholeheartedly. In 2019, I accompanied former U.S. Representative Holland to the Counselor chapter in the Navajo Nation. We saw and smelled the flaring of methane gas from wells. These wells were in proximity to homes. Imagine the propane flaring one sees when a hot air balloon is being prepared for flight. That is the type of flaring we saw that day, only methane is 84 more times worse than carbon dioxide and contributes to 25% of global warming. The United States is still one of the leading contributors to global warming. And with that methane come the VOCs that create smog, which basically has the effect of a sunburn on our lungs. We must reverse course. I spoke to one of our hosts from that visit in 2019 recently. He told me there was no change. If anything, there are more wells. Approximately 4,000 more permits have been issued. Not only is the oil and gas industry drilling more there, they don't seem willing to support even the most basic good neighbor regulations. My friend hosted another group recently to Counselor. This time it was a group of high school students. The students drew the flaring they saw and wrote down what they were witnessing in their journals. The field trip was shortened because my friend did not want them to develop headaches due to the methane and co-pollutants all around them. I had to ask myself, if a visiting class of kids could get a headache from breathing this air, what does it mean for people who live close to these facilities? For that reason, I'd like to see the EIB build on these strong proposed rules in 3 ways. 1, protect those living closest to development by requiring more frequent inspections to find and fix leaks. 2, ensure strong requirements for operators to control pollution during the completion of an oil or gas well, as well as when they redevelop an existing well. 3, strengthen requirements to cut pollution from pneumatic controllers that are used in oil and gas production. The devices are the second largest source of oil and gas methane emissions in New Mexico. NMED should require companies to inspect these for leaks and accelerate the timeline to retrofit equipment with zero bleed or zero emission controllers. Join me and help the governor, Secretary Kenny, and fellow advocates to help ensure we see the counties of Lee, Eddy, and San Juan counties earn an A for cleanliness of their air. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. McKenna. Our other 3 commenters are on the telephone, as I understand it. Caller 25, I've unmuted you. Who is this, please? Caller 25, can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to move to caller 26. Caller 26, can you hear me?
Hello?
Oh, yes, hello. Tell me who this is.
Yeah, this is Dee Dee Camello. I don't know what number I am.
Okay, no, that's
Um,
great. Would you spell your name, please?
yes, ma'am. Dee, and the last name is Dicamillo.
Thank you. And if you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. I'm going to start your 5 minutes now.
Thank you. I am not a politician, and I am not as erudite as Miss McKenna in relation to the specifics of what we're talking about. I have been an art teacher and an art history teacher for 35 years, and at UNM through Taos Academy and Taos High School for many years. And I saw many children when I taught elementary and high school who had asthma, who had different forms of lung problems. My stepson is a doctor who's in at Albuquerque in Presbyterian Hospital, and he has seen the same kinds of increases in asthma in children. So basically what I want to say is I think it's unconscionable that 130,000 New Mexicans live within a half mile of oil and gas development. And as we can see from Ms. McKenna's testimony, the methane gas produces smog that is absolutely horrid on the lungs and the health of children. It is a shame that the oil and gas operations that release 1 million metric tons of climate warming methane each year will inevitably increase by 70% the droughts that have been happening in the last several years. And we need, given what New Mexico, in terms of our ecosystems, given who we are and what we are, the high desert with large skies, with big skies and wind potential and solar potential. We need to be leaders in solar and wind energy, in clean energy. We need to be leaders, and we need to emphasize ecotourism through having a leadership in solar and wind power. It is unconscionable and unbelievable that a state so beautiful, a state with so much tourism, is degrading the potential for good health in our children and degrading the potential for ecotourism in this state. And anyway, I want to say that I love New Mexico, and we need to love it to the point where we protect it. We protect our air, our water, our skies, our children, and our adults. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. DiCamillo. Going to unmute caller 27. Caller 27, can you hear me?
Am I 27?
Yes, you are. Who is this?
Okay. This is David Anderson. I'm
Wait,
in
hold
southern
on.
New Mexico.
Hold on. I
Okay.
need you to spell your name,
All right.
please.
I'm sorry. Dave Anderson, Anderson.
Thank you. And if you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
I'm going to start your 5 minutes now. Thank you.
I live in southern New Mexico. I've been here, oh gosh, I came here in 75. I've been interested in solar for a long time. Actually, I use solar on my house now. I've converted completely to solar. I do have a little bit of propane occasionally, if backup if necessary. But my point is, we live in probably one of the best states, like the last person said, in the United States for solar. Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado. We should be developing solar and wind, I think, for the whole nation. Now, I also feel like that if we put solar on every house and we push that, we will get these emissions down fairly quick. There has to be a way, there has to be some sort of catalyst, though, to get people to want to do this. Now, I chose to do this because actually I lived in Canada for about 6 years, and my stepson worked in the oil sands. It was probably the worst place on the planet to live. He would come back every time he would go there. He was an electrician. He would come back. He had welts all over his body, and these welts would stay on his skin for up to 2 weeks before they would start to dissipate. This has, if anybody is exposed to these type of toxins, and I think we are in New Mexico. If you look at Artesia and some of the areas in southern New Mexico, Carlsbad, you're seeing this in the air. And I went to Midland about 2 years ago, and I was like, boy, the air is just, it's like gray all the time. It didn't used to be like that. So it is getting worse. We do need to jump on this right away. I do think we're in a bad situation right now. I know the United States is one of the worst, but we've got other big countries that are also really, really bad. I don't know what China is right now. I don't know if they're number 1 or number 2 in the nation or in the world as far as emissions, but I know they are pushing solar big time now, solar and wind. I think we need to, like caller 26 said, we need to be the leaders. We should be the leaders. We can start here in New Mexico and expand out if that's what it takes. I know we're up against a lot of opposition with oil and gas, but that's actually, that's going to go down and down more and more, because oil and gas, as we know, is a fossil fuel. We're not going to have it forever, and it's such a pollutant. I believe BP, one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the world, is also has started using solar, and is one of the largest producers in solar energy as well. I could be wrong on that. You can correct me on that. But so somebody is trying. We just need to get these big oil companies to start switching over. And I think with these bills being passed, that's the best way to do it. I just hope it passes. And I'm not sure we're going to get all of it done at one time. And maybe we ought to rethink this. If we don't get it done at one time, maybe we should rethink it and try to do it in chunks so we get it all done. But we definitely have to do it. And I am very concerned about our kids. I'm very concerned about my grandkids. I've got 4 granddaughters who live in Denver, Colorado. I'm very concerned about them. I'm very concerned about their environment as they grow older. I'm very concerned about the animals and the rest of the humans. My next step is an electric car. My house is electrified. I'm all electric now and all solar. And now I'm going towards the car. And I think that's what we need to do, is start little steps and start moving in that direction. I think that's all my time.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. All right. Let me go back to caller 25. Is this you, Miss Perkins? Caller 25. All right. It's not working. All right. I believe then finally we go to Sanders Moore. Here we go. I've unmuted you. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. If you would
Okay.
please spell your name for the transcripts.
Yes. My name is Sanders Moore, Sanders Moore.
Thank you.
And I'm actually going to make a statement on behalf of Senator Mimi Stewart, which is Mimistewart.
All right. If you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, board members. I'm Sanders Moore, Senate President Pro Tempore, Mimi Stewart's Chief of Staff. She sends her regrets that she's unable to join you today herself. and I will read a statement on her behalf. Thank you, board members, for your time and attention to this serious and important issue. Ozone has a huge impact on our climate and our health. It is a major pollutant created by oil and gas operations, putting everyone's health at risk, especially children, elderly, and frontline communities, which are disproportionately rural, low-income, and communities of color. Governor Lujan Grisham has been a leader in addressing climate change and pollution in New Mexico. She signed an executive order during her first month in office, laying out her climate priorities and action during her tenure, including addressing the very high levels of methane we emit in New Mexico, of which ozone is a byproduct. I am pleased to see these rules moving forward. New Mexico should be at the forefront of addressing climate change and by extension, mitigating the adverse health impacts caused by ozone pollution. Thank you for the strong draft rule that you issued this spring. I encourage the EIB to support 3 important improvements for the final rule. First, to require more frequent inspections to find and fix leaks at well sites close to schools and homes. Second, require companies to control pollution during well completions. And finally, to strengthen the requirements to reduce pollution from pneumatic controllers. Thank you for your time and consideration. And then if it's all right, I'd like to just make a couple comments myself.
Yes.
Speaking on behalf of myself as Sanders Moore, I'm a mother of a toddler, and I am personally very concerned about the fate of our planet and our pollution. I watch the air quality on an app on my phone fairly regularly to determine whether I should take my child to the playground. And I don't take her outside when ozone and other pollutants are high because I don't want it to cause long-term health impacts for my daughter. Living in Albuquerque, I have the luxury to check that and to stay inside when it is unsafe for her little lungs. But people living in frontline communities do not have that luxury. They're breathing the bad air quality regularly. And these communities have paid the price with their health for decades. We need to protect these families and ensure that health of all New Mexicans and globally is protected from ozone pollution. So I also encourage to make those important changes that the senator is also encouraging. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moore. All right, we have reached the end of the public comment session for this evening. We will return to the technical case if we could get Mr. Smitherman back and Mr. Heiser. Let's see here.
I see Mr. Smitherman as well.
All right, great. Please go ahead.
Mr. Smitherman, please proceed with your SIR rebuttal, but when we hit slide 10, make sure that you don't address that. Let me speak to that.
Be happy to do so. Am I sharing my slide properly?
It is still in what is normal view instead of presentation view.
You know, I think I'm going to have to leave it there
Okay.
because it does some funny things when I don't.
And you're also looking at things again for the court reporter. So if maybe you could move forward towards your speaker.
Certainly. Let's go ahead and start, shall we? Part of my SIR rebuttal is going to be responding to some comments and criticisms that NMED made. They believe that Moga's analysis lacks specificity. Also, the NMED has challenged some of the bases of our analysis, and I'll try to address those for the board's edification. And I'm going to start with well sites, if I could, please. We believe that ERG's analysis is flawed. Emissions reductions in their analysis are overestimated, mostly because their model plant is flawed. I talked a little bit about that in my introduction. Their major equipment counts are high, hence the component counts are high, hence the emissions are high.
Hey, Mr. Smitherman?
Yes.
You're fading out on us.
Oops, I'm sorry. Maybe I can turn my video off. I think that would help.
That might.
Let me stop sharing just for a moment and see if I can figure this out. Is that any better?
A little bit. You're just going to have to make sure you speak up, and we may ask you periodically to speak up again.
Okay. ERG's analysis is flawed for a couple of reasons. The emissions reductions are overestimated, mostly because of the model plant flaws that I've just discussed. The leak frequency is also flawed, and the costs are underestimated. So the combination of those two results in results that are not reliable. Let's talk about the emissions reductions. Specific critique was that NMED cannot evaluate the validity or representativeness of the alternate model plants mentioned by Moga because Moga does not document in its testimony or exhibits the actual model plants they created and on which they estimated new emission reductions and cost effectiveness numbers. Our response, and again, pardon me for having to read this, but the comments were very specific. I want to make sure that I've gotten them correct. Moga did provide the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program file, Exhibit 27, that was used to construct the more current and representative model plants. The data is also publicly available. In my sole rebuttal, Moga will provide additional information on those model plants, although I think we'll skip that. What is a model plant? We've talked about this in my introduction. It's a statistically average facility, average number of equipment counts, average number of components per equipment, and results in an average number of components per site. ERG's model plant used 1996 data from the CTG. Some of that data was not specific to New Mexico. In fact, some of it was not even specific to upstream oil and gas sector. Moga's model plant used recent 2019 greenhouse gas reporting data specific to the San Juan and Permian basins.
All right, so wait on this, Mr. Smitherman. This is slide 10. So, Madam Hearing Officer, at this point, as discussed, Moga would be making a proffer. And so I would state that if Mr. Smitherman were to testify, he would state that this shows how Moga developed the number of model plant equipment counts from the greenhouse gas data by dividing that by the number of wells as explained in his testimony. Then used the average component count per equipment, which is the same as the ERG data, that's that middle section, to calculate a new average component count per model plant, which would be seen on the right-hand side. And that would then be used in the basis for calculating the emissions changes from the leak reduction frequencies.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Smitherman, you can advance to slide number 11, which is also one of the ones that we are doing a proffer on. So this is the example of if you apply that calculation to the well site side. This, unlike the first slide, slide 10, which was gas facilities, this one presents the same information. I'm sorry, John, you're moving all around on me.
Sorry.
We're now back on slide 11. So this presents the information for oil wells, and it had it divided into the two categories that were used of less than 300 gas to oil ratio and over 300 gas to oil ratio. Once again, he would have testified that they took the number from the greenhouse gas reporting program, divided that by the number of wells divided by number 2 to come up with the site, used the ERG data from the CTG for the average component count to then calculate a new average component count for the model plant site.
Thank you.
That completes the proffer on this slide, Madam Hearing Officer. Go ahead, John, to slide number 12, and I think you may resume on this one.
Thank you, sir. This is the ERG model plant that they used as the basis of their calculation. As you can see here, there is a certain number of equipment counts for each of the different equipment types. They have components, average numbers of components that are associated with each one of those. There are, for example, 21.6 valves associated with a separator. and you multiply those two together to get the average component count for each of those equipment types, for each of those component types. And you get a total of all of the components that are at that site that have the potential to leak.
And so, Tom, if I could interrupt you there. So basically you take the second column, the model plant equipment count, and then you multiply that, in this case, by the third column, the average valves, and then you go to the component count per model plant, and that 19 is the 2 times the 9.5. Is that correct?
That's
and
correct.
2 times 37 to get the 74, and that's how you're constructing this table.
That's correct. And the result is a total number of components that you see here. And, you know, our numbers would have been lower than that because of the most recent greenhouse gas reporting data, equipment counts. We also have ERG's model plant for oil well sites, both sites with a lower GOR than 300 and a GOR equal to or greater than 300. Same process, the equipment counts here, the number of components per equipment, or excuse me, the average number of those equipment types, components total here. So again, you end up with a total number of components at the site, at an oil well site greater than or equal to 300. Our numbers would have been similarly constructed, but would have resulted in lower numbers.
And John, before you move on from this slide, could you remind the board what GOR means and why that's important?
Gas oil ratio. It really distinguishes between oil wells that don't produce a lot of associated gas and oil wells that produce quite a bit of associated gas. Many of your, I want to call them older water flood, older conventional oil wells produced little gas as associated with each barrel of oil. And the number is 300 standard cubic feet of gas per barrel of oil.
Thank you for that.
Basic wells in unconventional tend to be higher than 300 GOR.
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. Thank you for that clarification of the term GOR. Please proceed.
As I mentioned in my opening, there is a table that's been established by the EPA that in essence gives you the amount of emissions reduction that you're going to get with differing LDAR frequencies. If you do annual LDAR surveys, you will get a 40% reduction in your model plant's emission. It's a straight calculation. And if you get semi-annual, you'll get 60% reduction, quarterly 80%, monthly 90%. There are some slight differences between whether you use an OGI or a method 21, but in essence, this has been simplified to give you the numbers that we used in our calculations.
And John, before you move from that slide, can you go back for a minute? Was one of the points that was important to Moga was that there was a large gain from starting LDAR at all, but that the gain seems to go down as we increase the frequency?
It does. In fact, as you can see, specifically the gains between quarterly and monthly are relatively small. And you go from annual, every 12 months to every 6 months, and you get a 20% increase. You go from 6 months to 4 months, you get 20% reduction, additional 20% reduction. So you can see that there's a diminishing return.
Okay, thank you.
So when you tabulate the emission reductions at these model plants, you get these results. Here is the CTG basis that ERG came up with for their gas well sites. If you perform annual LDAR, you get a 0.61 ton per year VOC reduction on a gas well site. If you perform semi-annual, you'll get a 0.917. And if you do quarterly, a 1.222 ton per year VOC reduction. Using our model plant, those reductions, since the emissions are smaller, the reductions are also smaller. It runs from 0.509 tons per year down to 1.018 tons per year. And I've got a little tabulation to illustrate the percentage reduction between ERG's data and Moga's data. For gas well sites, it's a 16.7% reduction. For low GOR sites, it's a 27.9% reduction. And for those oil well sites with equal to or greater than 300 GOR, almost 60% reduction. I gave you a sample calculation here. I won't go through that. It's pretty straightforward.
And just as a reminder, John, was that due principally to the difference in the component count between the CTG and the greenhouse gas reporting?
That's actually the only difference. So once you then couple that with cost to put it on a cost per ton basis, and by the way, we used the same cost basis that the department used, the CTG basis, and applied it to our model plant emissions reduction. So the only difference here is the emissions reduction that comes from the model plant equipment counts. As you can see, the lower emission impact yields higher per ton costs. And those get higher and higher depending on whether you're in a gas well site or one of the lower or higher GOR oil well sites. Again, looking at the percentage change, gas well sites are almost 20% higher. Low GOR oil sites are almost 40% higher. And high GOR well sites are almost 150% higher. And again, a sample calculation for your edification. Now, we believe that the leak frequency that ERG used, and we actually used the same numbers, has been overestimated. So we looked into that as a sensitivity to at least have the board understand that had we used a higher leak or lower leak frequency, our numbers would have been, in essence, worse. They would have been higher. So we're being conservative by using the CTG leak frequency data when there's data that indicates that we could have used probably better data. The ERG EPA data found that sites start off with about 4 leaks per site initially. And in all of these studies, these leak frequencies tend to go down over time as LDAR is continues to be instigated. API study based on 2 years of quarterly LDAR and over 6,000 sites, or excuse me, surveys across almost 3,500 sites, found that they start off with less than 2 leaks per site. It was about 1.6 actually, and it dropped quickly to less than 1 leak per site over time. So we believe that ERG data overstates the leak rate, therefore overstates the emissions. We did this as a sensitivity. We did not include this in our calculations. I'm going to pause and go to a specific NMED rebuttal. The leak frequencies API generated from the Quad OA report is not representative of New Mexico, since the facilities being surveyed are the new and modified facilities subject to the LDAR requirements in Quad OA. And they're not representative of the older facilities and sites in New Mexico. And while we agree that the facilities and API frequencies analysis are newer than many of the New Mexico facilities, they're no less representative than leak frequencies developed decades ago that were based on even older data and included industries besides oil and gas segments. So again, we looked at the leak frequencies. We recognized that there's a real possibility that the ERG leak frequencies that they used are too high and we used are too high. But that basically says that our numbers are conservative. Again, a specific comment, Moga does not provide the detailed comparison of the results of the study to the frequency or emission rates that were the basis of the 2016 CTG estimates of cost effectiveness. We did provide study papers and supplemental information in our exhibits 5 and 14 that compare the various other leak frequencies and emission rates that are discussed. Some of those are the 2016 leak CTG leak frequency of about 1.18, API at 0.42 of components leaking. The API leak study rates per leaking component are higher overall than those underpinning the 2016 CTG. I'm going to move on.
Okay.
Costs are underestimated at well sites also. Again, as a sensitivity, Moga looked into the validity of the costs that ERG used and we used to underpin their cost per ton and their emission reduction costs. We, again, used the same CTG data that they did, but we did this as a sensitivity. And API commented, as you've heard earlier from other witnesses, on the 2016 CTG and believed that the costs were underestimated for the conducting of the leak surveys, completing the repairs, maintaining records. Also, they completely omitted costs for personnel training, travel time and cost, and equipment maintenance. So we believe that these costs that ERG used are too low. We used them also, but we're also pointing out that had we used these higher cost numbers, then the resulting cost per ton would have been much higher. It again points to the fact that our numbers are conservative. Again, a specific comment, EPA fully responded to API's comments and the responses to comments beyond the scope of this rulemaking for NMED to revisit the issue. You heard that earlier today. Moga included the API cost as a sensitivity and did not use it in our actual calculations. We included it to illustrate that the impacts of cost per LDAR survey and the cost per ton of reductions are low and costs do matter. Moga does believe the costs are underestimated in this rulemaking and that the agency undertaking the rulemaking has the obligation to gather and use the most current and accurate information available in their analysis, costs, and other data. Moga would be happy to assist NMED in gathering current cost information from New Mexico operators, which would be representative of the actual costs of operations and challenges. Let's move to gathering and boosting stations. Again, the emissions are overestimated at gathering and boosting stations using their model plant. It's again based on 1996 EPA data. It's an EPA GRI study, and it's not representative of current populations of gathering and boosting stations in New Mexico. Moga's model plant was based on a Colorado State University Department of Energy 2019 major study that yielded fewer equipment counts, fewer components, and lower potential leak emissions than ERG used. And now, Mr. Heiser.
So, Madam Hearing Officer, this is another proffer slide. If Mr. Smitherman were to testify on this slide, he would explain how Moga looked at the CSU report and from certain tables in that report selected the number of pieces of equipment in the model plant. You see sort of in the second column, and then from different tables, collected the average component count per equipment, and then multiplied those to calculate the average component count for the model plant, very similar to what we saw for the well sites in the earlier stages. And that would complete Moga's proffer on this point.
Thank you.
So my next slide is the model plant that ERG used on gathering and boosting stations. Once again, the similar type of structure where you've got your equipment counts, you've got your average component per equipment, which yields the average component count per model plant for each of these different component types, and you sum them at the bottom. Our numbers would have been similar in their structure, but the numbers would have been lower than these. Similarly, we have used their model plant and our model plant to calculate estimated emissions reductions. Now here is the slide, Mr. Heiser, that has a small error in it, and it's a consistent error. We've had just basically used a wrong cell reference in a spreadsheet, and basically every one of these 8 numbers here are 6.5% too low. The numbers that we are showing you are, let me get this right, lower than the numbers that we had in our original testimony, 6.5%.
These numbers have come down by 6.5% from what was presented in your original testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct. That is correct. So the numbers here, as you can see, the tons per year reduced are quite different between ERG estimates and the Permian and the Moga estimates.
So, Mr. Smitherman, can you explain why in the previous times that we were talking about this, we didn't have a differentiation between basins? And now suddenly when we get to gathering and boosting, there is a differentiation?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. The reason is we have data from the San Juan Basin, from the San Juan Basin Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, and we have specific data from the Permian Basin from that same source. ERG only has their CTG information, which does not differentiate between those two basins. So again, showing you the numbers, San Juan Basin, 82% lower, Permian sites, 55.6% lower. Again, another sample calculation for your edification. Once again, a specific comment. Moga fails to note the findings of the study that, quote unquote, the study indicates that study emission factors either agree with or are larger than current greenhouse gas reporting program emission factors for the Western US, unquote. The NMED analysis also does not take into account the estimated leak rates in standard cubic feet per hour, including the presence of large emitters relative to those that were the basis of the 2016 CTG estimates.
Mr. Smitherman, let me stop you there. In the second sentence, you said the NMED analysis. Did you mean the Moga analysis?
Excuse me, I misspoke. The Moga analysis. This is a comment from NMED commenting on Moga's analysis. Thank you. Our response is the Moga used the emission factors. You'll see them in Table 4 of our Exhibit 28, developed by the study authors to calculate potential equipment leak emissions and the frequency-dependent reduction percentages used by ERG and NMED in our analysis. Since the Moga used emissions factors developed from the study, that's from the Colorado State University DOE study, measurements in these emission factors incorporate the study measurements, including large emitters. The division comments are simply not correct. Again, a specific criticism. Moga does not provide any details regarding how the results of the second paper that's the Colorado State DOE study, were used to adjust the VOC reduction estimates from those in the 2016 CTG to those in Moga's testimony, or how they were used to adjust the cost per ton of VOC reduced. Moga did supply the Colorado State University DOE study, part of our Moga exhibits 28 and 7, and we responded to those materials, and NMED responded to those materials, and clearly they had access. Some of the details of how Moga used the Colorado State University Department of Energy study to construct a more current model plant for gathering and boosting facilities, and then to calculate potential emissions, frequency-dependent reductions, and cost per ton of reductions. One, Moga used the major equipment per gathering and boosting station, which you'll find in Table 6, Moga Exhibit 28, to establish the count of major equipment types per station. Two, Moga used the component counts per piece of major equipment. Those are tables S3 through 30 through S3-30 through S3-35 in the Colorado State Department of Energy Gathering and Boosting Station Study Supplemental Information, Volume 3, which you find in our Moga Exhibit 7. Multiplied by the count of major equipment to calculate the number of components per station. Continuing that same comment, Moga then multiply the components count by the study-derived emission factors, which you'll find in Table 4 in Moga's Exhibit 28, to calculate the standard cubic feet of emissions per model study. Then Moga divided the emissions by 1,000 to convert them to MCF, and then multiplied the results by the pound of VOCs per MCF. As I explained earlier, you basically take whole gas and reduce it to the amount of VOCs, specifically in the San Juan Basin and the Permian Basins, respectively, to arrive at the mass of emissions, VOC emissions per station. Note that the result is based on actual New Mexico data, and is certainly more representative than the outdated and non-representative information used by ERG. The mass of emissions per station, which represents potential equipment leak emissions, was then multiplied by the same reduction factors that ERG used for the different LDAR survey frequencies to calculate the reductions per station. And as I've already mentioned, 40%, 60%, and 80% reductions, depending on the frequency. We did create a 90% reduction monthly surveys. It's a little wonky. I won't go through the details of that. Moga then used the ERG and NMED cost for a different leak survey, for the different leak survey frequencies to calculate the per ton cost of reductions. A different criticism or comment from NMED, given the uncertainty regarding the cost used by ERG and NMED in their analysis of the rule impacts, Moga does not think considering the minimally lower cost associated with less components and less leaks is particularly relevant to the cost per ton of reduction. Our response, as the division knows, major parts of the cost per survey are buying the camera and support equipment, training personnel, traveling to and from the sites, excuse me, especially remote sites in New Mexico, firing up and checking the equipment, conducting the survey itself, documenting the survey results in a database, creating work orders for repairs, obtaining parts, planning for personnel for repairs, traveling to and from sites for repairs, making the repairs and documenting the repairs in a database. There's lots and lots of steps that are associated with that. So only part of the cost per survey that vary with the number of components per site is in the survey time, and cost per survey is not particularly sensitive to the difference in survey time, given the other cost drivers and the fact that gathering a boosting station is still complex and takes about the same time to survey. The only parts of the cost per survey that vary with the number of leaks are obtaining the parts for repair and making the actual repairs. Although fewer leaks will require fewer repairs, the cost differential is not that great. Also, as the division knows, as the frequency of survey increases, the number of leaks per survey goes down, and the proportion of the survey cost attributable to repairs also decreases to a point that the differential cost for fixing one leak versus three is really not that relevant.
And so as part of the comment here, John, really that by the time you get to a gathering and boosting station, they're much more complex than a typical well site would be. So there's more components and you're going to have to spend a certain amount of time at that facility sort of regardless.
Exactly. And the cost driver really is the survey itself. The repairs are a small part of the cost that is included in our cost estimate, but it's mostly the cost of the survey. So when you take those costs and you apply them to the VOC reductions, you get this table here. Again, we had a small change, at 6.5% change in the numbers. They cascade to these as well. So these are the corrected numbers. And again, you have San Juan base numbers and Permian Basin base numbers relative to the one single number set for New Mexico from the CTG. Once again, I show you that the San Juan Basin sites are 460% higher. Permian Basin sites 125% higher. So the ERG's dollar per ton estimates understate the New Mexico actuals. And again, once more, sample calculation.
Okay, so John, maybe you could go back for a second to your prior slide. Does this slide sort of show for you one of Moga's concerns about moving to the monthly frequency compared to the other frequencies that are under discussion?
It does. As you can see, the cost per ton as frequency goes up do go up, but it's a big difference going from quarterly to monthly. And that happens for whatever reason that you're changing that frequency from semi-annual or quarterly to monthly. The fact that you're going from quarterly 4 times a year to monthly 12 times a year is a big, big jump, and it causes the cost per ton to go up markedly.
Thank you, John. Please continue.
So, as I said in my opening, there's lots of numbers here that talk about the actual cost per ton for performing LDAR. We've gone through a lot of those so far. But the most germane calculation is looking at what's the incremental benefit and what's the incremental cost to go from one frequency to another. As I said at the outset, Moga supports LDAR, but at frequencies that are reasonable. Additional LDAR survey costs are basically scalable. I just mentioned that most of the costs are basically conducting the survey itself. So it's not the repair costs that are driving the total cost. It's simply performing the surveys. More frequent LDAR surveys also result in lower per survey emission reduction. That's that diminishing returns I mentioned before. You combine those two concepts, and incremental dollars per ton moves to unreasonable levels. Here's a comparison of the proposals now. Moga is recommending that for well sites, annual LDAR for every site that has a PTE less than 10 tons per year, semi-annual equal to 10, less than 25 tons per year, and quarterly for any sites with equal to 25 tons per year or more. And NMED has now come back to less than 2 tons a year for annual, between 2 and less than 5 for semi-annual, and greater than 5 or greater, I should say, to be quarterly. So, how do you do an incremental analysis? More frequent LDAR surveys cost more money. As I said, mostly scalable. Slightly less than scalable due to fewer leaks discovered and repaired. Emission reductions are a little lower with more frequent LDARs. So higher costs for lower emission reduction yields a cost to benefit ratio that's higher. Some of them very high. Let's take a look on well sites. This is using the ERG costs and the Moga well plant, model plant for well sites emissions reductions. Cost per ton to go from annual to semi-annual on well natural gas well sites, low GOR well sites, and high GOR oil well sites are from $3,900 to $21,000 per ton. If you go from annual to quarterly in those same well types, $5,900 to $31,000. And when you look at semi-annual to quarterly, you go from almost $8,000 to over $42,000 per ton. And that's on well sites. When you go to gathering and boosting stations, gas plants and transmission compressor stations, our recommendation is that anything with under 25 tons per year is semi-annually, and anything equal to or greater than 25 tons per year is quarterly. NMED has started off at less than 25 tons per year is quarterly, and asked for monthly LDAR on any of these sites that is 25 tons per year or more. That results in some very, very large incremental costs. When you go from semi-annual to quarterly, our costs indicate that the incremental cost per ton in the San Juan Basin is $34,000 per ton. When you go to quarterly, when you go from quarterly to monthly, look at what the numbers do. $300,000 per ton incrementally to go from quarterly to monthly. That's what happens when you basically, in one sense, don't look at the incremental costs that we're asking the industry to bear to perform more frequent LDARs. One more comment that NMED had expressed. They expressed concern that tying LDAR requirements to the NSPS programs may be inadequate because the federal requirements could be changed or rescinded. And the Moga suggests that NMED adopt the federal requirements of a certain date to freeze the requirements as desired. And that's the end of my summary.
Okay, and then so we do have a couple of slides for a proffer at the end, Madam Hearing Officer. These go to occupied area. On this slide, Mr. Smither would have testified that the Oxy EDF proposal would increase the number of frequencies, and that is not necessary because large emitters are covered by AVOs and some of the other inspections, and it also increases the cost. And that would be Moga's proffer on this slide. The next slide, which is slide, I believe, 53, here he would have repeated the general concern is that the cost to serve is the surveys, and this can cause a large incremental cost increase, and he would have represented it would have ranged in the range of 18,000 to 69,000 if he had testified on this, and that would be Moga's proffer on this slide. And then on this slide, he would have presented those same costs basically in a tabular form just to show them as they relate to the differences between well sites, which have a lower cost, versus certain types of oil and gas sites, or oil sites that have a much higher cost and potentially nearly $99,000 cost. That would have been his proffer on this slide. On this slide, he would have done the same thing, but this case showing going from semi-annual to monthly, showing the incremental VOC reductions, and then showing that the costs range from 28 to about 150,000. And that would have been his proffer or his testimony on this slide. I think there's one more. And the last one, he would have gone from quarterly to monthly, once again discussing the well sites and the two different types of oil sites, showing the incremental VOC reductions, and then calculating what that would be an incremental ranging from 68 to 300, greater than 350,000. And that would have been his testimony on that. And that completes Moga's proffer on Mr. Smitherman's slides here. In addition, we had offered 2 spreadsheets, and those spreadsheets basically contain the underlying data that were used to calculate the numbers that were presented in these tables. And we put them together just so that it was easier for the board, should they be admitted, to understand the calculations. And that would complete Moga's proffer for that. One of those would be on the well sites, and then the second one would be on the gathering and boosting site. So one wells, second gathering and boosting, because they have different data sources.
Thank you very much.
And I guess
Mr.
that
Heiser.
completes my proffer.
All right, thank you, Mr. Heiser. Are we ready then to go to questioning for Mr. Smitherman? And could we take just a very short break before we do that?
Yes, that'd be fine, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, let's just take 9 minutes, come back at 6:10. Thank you.